Good afternoon. 25 years ago, I used to play in bands. We aspired to be successful musicians and rock stars and play venues like this, and we never, ever made it this far. So thanks for making my dream come true, especially today. This is amazing. Speaking of interesting jobs and interesting choices, my first job out of college, I graduated from college, undergraduate school in 1995. I graduated on a Saturday, and on Monday, I joined the circus. This was the circus that I joined, right here. These are my photos that I took. This is the Clyde Beatty Cole Brothers Circus, and at the time, it was the largest three-ring tented circus in America. So very classic circus. We had three rings, elephants, and tigers, and the whole thing. And I spent 6 months on the road with the circus, traveling across, well, not across America, but up and down the East Coast. And over the course of time that I spent there, I met a lot of interesting people. And for example, just to give you one example of interesting people that I met, there was Mr. Steven Tyler, and that's him on the right, and that's me on the left. I told you I wanted to be a rock star, right? It's been 20 years have taken their toll on my hairline a little bit, but Mr. Tyler's done a good job of preserving himself since then. He looks pretty much the same. Another really interesting person that I met that summer, or those 6 months that I spent, was this guy. This is the human cannonball. Okay? And if you can't see him on it's a big slide, that's him right there at the top. Okay, and essentially this guy worked, so we did 2 shows a day every day. This guy worked 2 minutes per show, 4 minutes a day. That was his job. He would slide in the cannon, they'd fire him, he'd land, everybody would clap. In between the shows, we had a lot of free time. Once the last show was over for the night, we didn't have to go anywhere, and so the next show was at 4 o'clock the next day. We had about 20 hours of free time. And you get bored, and you start to have conversations, you start to think. And it dawned on me that there was no clear career path to one becoming the human cannonball. And so I asked him one day, how does one become the human cannonball? How did you become the human cannonball? And he told me the story. I'm going to share that story with you because it's a fascinating story. And of course, the story starts with the previous human cannonball. So I need to give you a little bit of context about how this works. So this is not an actual cannon, right? There's no fire actually happening here. It's just a spring-loaded thing that cocks down. He slides in. The ringmaster pushes a button. It shoots him out. There's a little puff of smoke. And on the other side is a net that catches him, somewhere on the other side. Now, the previous human cannonball and his team would set up the same way every day. The way they knew where to put the net every time is they had a dummy, a mannequin, that was the same size and weight as the previous human cannonball. And so we'd come into a new town, they would set up the tent, the elephants would pull the tent poles into place. It was really kind of a cool scene. Everybody would come out to see it. And then they would drive the truck into the tent, they'd park it in the same spot every time, aim the cannon, put the dummy in, shoot it, and then kind of see where it landed, and that's where they would put up the net. And this worked day after day after day, night after night, place after place for years. One night, we ended late, and we had to drive all night to the next place. And when they got to the next circus lot, we didn't have time to set up that night. This was the previous human cannonball, so this was before the year before. They didn't have time to set up. And so they parked the truck, they took the dummy out, they left it out overnight to set up the next day, and it rained overnight. The next day, they do exactly what they did the day before, which was they drove the truck into the tent, they aimed it, they put now a wet dummy into the cannon, they fire it, they see where it lands, they put the net up. That afternoon, the previous human cannonball gets in the cannon, waves goodbye to 4,000 children who are now in the tent to see him fly. They fire the cannon, and he sails way past the net in front of all of these children. Now, he didn't die, but he did get pretty seriously hurt, and he went back to Florida to recover. Florida is where all circuses come from, in case you were curious. And he went back to recover, and he saw that he had a pool. Everybody in Florida has a pool. He had a pool boy, the guy who cleans his pool, which was this all-American football player-looking guy, and he offered him a job upgrade. He said, "Would you like to be the human cannonball? And you work 4 minutes a day. You make a lot more money." And sure, he took the gig, and that's how this guy became the human cannonball. Now, why am I telling you this story, right? The reason I'm telling you this story is because the previous human cannonball and his team made the same assumptions day in and day out that nothing would ever change. And they performed their job exactly the same way, assuming nothing would ever change. And then the one time that something changed, that they didn't verify that all of their assumptions were true, they met with tragic consequences. And that's what's happening in the world of design and software today. Yesterday's assumptions about how we build products, how we design products and services don't work in today's realities. Our reality is changing. And the reason that our realities are changing is this. It's something Mark Andreessen famously said back in 2011. He said, "Software is eating the world." And what he meant by that is that everything is becoming software. Any business of scale or any business that desires to scale at its core is going to be or is a software business, a digital business. Think about the most successful companies we see today, right? Amazon, for example. Amazon, you could ask somebody what business they're in. They'll tell you they're in retail, they're in books, right? They're in movies, right? Whatever it is that you buy from Amazon. But in reality, they're in the software business. The software of commerce, of retail, of logistics, of drones, of whatever it is they can think up of next, of services. And that's how they can scale, and that's how they can grow. It's changing the way that we think about the companies that we work in. And this is true regardless of industry. If you're in a business that seeks to scale or that wants to maintain its scale, software is the core of where everything is heading. And we're hearing this echoed across different companies. You can hear this from Ford Motor Company. They're talking about using software to shape the automotive experiences of tomorrow. You're hearing this from people like David Zanka, who runs IT at Federal Express, at FedEx. FedEx, you think, is a delivery company, a logistics company, but they would not be able to operate at the scale at which they do operate if they were not a software company at the core, which changes the way that we think about things. And the interesting thing is that we've seen this happen over and over and over again, right? 10, 12 years ago, Napster came along, and the music industry refused to believe that they would actually need technology and software to continue to operate at scale. And the Recording Industry Association of America tried to shut them down, and fellow Scandinavian Lars Ulrich tried very publicly to litigate them out of existence. And now, 10 years later, you can listen to Metallica on Spotify. Right? Software is eating the world. We're seeing this play out in the automotive industry right now in the United States with Tesla, Elon Musk's electric car company. He's radically disrupting how how cars are being sold, serviced, upgraded, and the automotive industry and the oil lobby are trying to litigate him out of existence. Keep an eye on that, because there's an inevitable transformation that's happening there that legislation is not going to fix. Software is eating the world. Netflix came along. No one believed it would change the way that we consume, distribute, and produce content. And yet today, if you're in the United States, I challenge you to find one of these that's actually still in business. Software is eating the world. Now look, this is the way that we used to make products in this assembly line model. And when you know all of the components of making a product, this is a terrific way to build products. Because you know what's going in, you know what it's going to look like when it's done, and you know how people are going to use it. So you can optimize and make everything super efficient. And this is how we built products through the industrial era. And then we took that model and we applied it to software. We built these silos, these discipline-specific silos that mimic the assembly line. Someone defines it, someone designs it, someone builds it, someone tests it, someone deploys it. Right? But the reality is that we don't know. Software is different. It's not like making a car or an iPhone, the actual physical components of the box. Software is different. And here's why. Software has become continuous. Software is never finished. Digital products never end. There's no end state. There is no finished state to software. We continually have the opportunity today to push our products forward at an ever faster pace. We can distribute the bits, the designs, the experiences that we create through the web, through mobile apps, and develop this continuous conversation with the market that starts to give us a level of feedback about what we're building in an unprecedented fashion. I want to put a fine point on this, just to give you a sense of what can be done with technology today. This is how often Amazon pushes code to production. Live bits to real users. Every 11.5 seconds, somebody at Amazon pushes real code to real people. Now, they're not refreshing the entire e-commerce checkout process every 11.5 seconds. They're not redoing the navigation. They're taking tiny chunks of risk. They're taking these experiments, these tiny experiments, and they're rolling them out to a sliver of the population. And they're learning very quickly if this is a good idea or a bad idea because they're getting immediate feedback. They're starting to build that continuous cycle, that continuous conversation with their audience. And if it's a good idea, they can scale it out. And if it's a bad idea, they can roll it back. But the learning that comes from that is huge. They now know how to progress a bit in a slightly smarter way the next time they attempt to do something like this. This is the level of conversation that the most sophisticated companies are having with their audience and their market right now. And yet, many of the companies that I work with are thinking like this. They're thinking about model years. How many features can we cram into the next release so we can add a point to the release number, right? How much more can we charge for it? How do we market it? What can we fit into the next 6 months of development so that we can call it new and exciting? And thinking about these finalized states of the actual product. And we work towards releases where everything feels like it should be perfect, right? And this is the way that we used to work. Now, I understand in Sweden, you guys weren't affected by this plague that's up on the screen right now. But in the US, 15, 20 years ago, you essentially got 3 of these a week in the mail. Right? These are America Online installation discs. And I was partially responsible for this. And I'm sorry for that. But this is where I worked 12, 13 years ago. And we worked on software that got distributed. Can you still hear me? That software that got distributed, I'll just talk loud, on hard media like this. It was shrink wrapped. It was in a box. We put it together. And we either shipped it to you or you went to a store and you bought it. And because we released a new one of these every 6 months, the feedback loop that we had was roughly 12 months because we would work for 6 months to create a perfect thing that we then duplicated 40 million times. We sent it out to everyone. We waited until they installed it. We learned from that usage and usability testing. And then we worked for another 6 months before we released something else, taking 12 months before we pushed new bits out to people, new experiences, new designs, improved customer experiences that we had no idea that they would even install. Right? We took those industrial era management tactics, we moved them over to software, but they don't work in this world. They don't work because there are too many unknowns. We don't know what it'll take to build this particular product. We don't know what the end state is going to look like. And I think most importantly, we really don't know how our customers are going to use these products. How many cases of software being used for something it wasn't designed to do have come up in the last few years? Right? So we have to think about how we work with our teams to build this. And so with this continuous conversation and this continuous feedback loop, we have to, as designers, as makers, as creative people who make digital products and services, we have some questions to answer. And the first is, what does this new continuous world mean for our business? How does it change the way that we sell the stuff that we sell or distribute it or get feedback from the market? The next thing we have to ask ourselves is, how do we take advantage of all this new information? Forget about releasing every 11.5 seconds. Even if you release once a month, if you're reducing that from every 6 months or every 3 months, you're starting to collect a ton of new quantitative and qualitative information about what customers are doing with your services. How do we take advantage of all that new information? And I think most importantly is how can we take advantage of that and maximize the creativity, the learning, and the productivity of our teams, because they're the ones who are going to have to be reactive, nimble, agile to use this information and then make changes to the products that we're designing and that we're building together. And the way that this actually plays out is you need to build this culture of innovation. Innovation is not something you sprinkle on top of your product or your process, but there has to be an underlying culture of innovation. And at the core, a culture of innovation is a culture of experimentation. Dave Maloof talked about Dave Gray earlier. I'm also going to talk about Dave Gray briefly. He wrote another book called The Connected Company, which is a terrific book, and I urge you to read it. And in that book, Dave talks about these two different types of strategy. There's this idea of deliberate strategy. Deliberate strategy means that all the creativity is held at the executive suite. The managers of an organization will determine what solutions make sense, and they will tell the teams to build it. Alternatively, there's emergent strategy. Emergent strategy is organic, and it lets the teams determine what solutions best solve our business problems through an ongoing culture of hypothesis and experimentation. It has to come from the bottom up. These organic ideas that bubble up, that are tested, and that are verified or invalidated before we move forward with the right product solution. And again, you hear all the leaders of all the big companies talk about this idea of hypothesis and experimentation. Jeff Bezos, right? You need to set up and organize so that you can do as many experiments per unit of time as possible, because every experiment brings you closer to a more accurate product solution, a design, a workflow. Eric Schmidt talks about this, just taking swings, and you hear Jack Welch, formerly of GE, talk about this as well. So how do you build this? How do you build this culture of innovation? What do you need to do to support this? And as we think about that, we have to think about the atomic unit of innovation. Right? The atomic unit of innovation, the smallest possible thing, is the team. That's the core of a culture of innovation. If you haven't seen Cool Runnings in a while, I highly recommend it, by the way. It was on during the Olympics, the Winter Olympics a lot. And so what I want to talk about, the bulk of this talk, is what makes up an innovative team. How do you build these teams that inherently skew towards high performance and better customer experiences? And there's three things I want to cover today. The first is the anatomy of the team. Who's on the team? How do we structure the makeup of that team? The second is how do we tell the team what to do? How do we task the team? And the last thing I want to talk about is how should the team work? Should they use Agile? Should they use Lean or Waterfall or Scrumfall, or Wagile, all the different variations of those. So let's go through these three things. And I'm going to set up each section with a set of anti-patterns, and then we'll solve for those anti-patterns. So let's talk about the anatomy of the team, the delicious anatomy of the team. First and foremost, we'll start with anti-patterns. How not to build an innovative team. All right, we're going to swap this out. They're switching me off from the Justin Timberlake mic to the Beyonce version. Thank you. Is that better? All right. I don't know what's happening back here. I feel like a Borg, but shake it off. Okay, how not to build an innovative team. First and foremost, put them in silos. Discipline-specific silos. When you put teams in discipline-specific silos, you isolate them. And when you isolate them, you diminish the communication between the team members. And when you diminish the communication between them, they rely more and more on written communication. Written communication takes time to create, to read, to digest, to react to write back, and that's a vicious cycle that costs you a lot of time. And then the only time really that team is communicating or negotiating is during the handoffs of that written communication. When you build these silos, the teams start to feel like service providers. They don't feel like members of a team. They don't feel like there's a holistic ownership of the product. They simply see themselves as somebody who does the thing for the product when it comes in front of them and it moves down the assembly line, right? I'm the person who puts the pixels in the right order. I'm the person who writes the use cases. I'm the person who puts the ones and zeros in the right order, right? There's no holistic ownership, and because of that, the teams don't have a view of the whole project, the program, or the corporate strategy. of the product. And they're making these keyhole decisions about, well, I'm going to turn this red instead of blue. Right? Maybe that makes sense, or maybe it doesn't. But realistically, who are we solving for? Whose problems are we solving, and what problem are we solving? And how does this play into our greater product strategy or portfolio? Right? You're making these keyhole decisions in these silos. Right? And lastly, siloed teams don't collaborate. They don't collaborate because they never hang out together. They don't build off of each other's ideas, and that's where the real magic happens at the team level. Now, I'm guilty of doing this exact thing. I started at a company called The Ladders 7 or 8 years ago, and my job was to build a UX team, a design team there, and the first thing I did was I built a silo, a design team, an internal agency. And as we built that team, as the practice grew, people would come to me, and they would say, the engineering team would say, we need a designer, or we need a visual designer, or we need a content strategist, or somebody to do this. And I would be the person in the middle that would be traffic copying all of these concerns. See, there I am. So people would come to me and they'd say, we need a designer. I'd say, okay, Bob's got some bandwidth, let's give it to Bob. And they'd say, we need a designer. I'd say, oh, Bob's got some more bandwidth, let's give it to Bob again. And somebody would say, well, we need somebody to do this. I'd say, okay, well, Bob's got some time, 10% of his time left, let's give it to him. And so what I was doing there was the exact thing I just told you not to do. I was isolating the team members from the teams. They were doing just enough work to move from project to project. And every time you task your teammates with supporting 2 to 3 teams, they're coming in every day and they're deciding who they want to piss off the least that day. Right? Because they've got to pick somebody's work to work on. They can't work on all 3 things at once. Right? And so this model was clearly broken, and we realized very quickly that we needed to break the team up and dedicate these resources onto their individual teams. And so the question then becomes, as you start to build these teams, what structure facilitates a culture of innovation? We just looked at all the things that don't do that. 4 things. And the internet, as we know, is great for cats. So, innovative team anatomy. The first thing is small teams, 6 to 8 people, what Jeff Bezos calls 2 pizza teams. You have to qualify that in Europe as 2 American pizza teams. And because they're significantly larger in the US. If you can't feed your team with 2 pizzas, the team is too big. Why is this important? When there are 6 people on the team, you know everybody on the team. You know their names, you know their email addresses, their phone numbers, and what they're responsible for doing. If you need some database help, you go to the database guy. You need some design help, you go to the designer. They're great for management because you have a sense of what everybody's doing. And most importantly, they're great for accountability. With 6 people on a team, if you're not doing your job, your teammates are going to let you know very, very quickly because there's no one to hide behind. There's no duplication of effort there. The second quality of an innovative team is co-located. In the same place, in the same space, not just in the same building or in the same campus if you work at a large company, working together in the same place, face-to-face, having conversation, sitting next to each other. Now, I recognize that that's not a reality for a lot of us. We work in agencies that are distributed, we have distributed clients, or we work in large companies with global offices. And that's also my reality. And so if you're going to try to build these teams with a distributed culture, you have to keep one rule in mind, and that is you have to be awake at the same time. You can't collaborate if your partner is sleeping. Right? It's important. So I live in New York. I have colleagues in Singapore. It's 12-hour time difference. Right? 13 hours depending on the season. There's no way we ever get to collaborate, not in real time. And that stinks. They're great people, but we don't ever get to work together. Okay? Small, co-located, dedicated. Everyone is working on this project. Nothing else. They're not being siphoned off to fix bugs over here or to design the CEO's pet project over there, right? Everybody's working on this project right now. Because if you start to get siphoned off, your 5 colleagues are waiting for you to do your job and you're holding them up. And there's an extreme cost for context switching between working on this and working on something else. Small, co-located, dedicated, and finally self-sufficient. And this is important. The team needs to be able to do whatever it needs to do with minimal or no external dependencies. So all of the competencies that the team needs to do its job should be on the team. Now notice I didn't say roles. Right? You don't necessarily need to have a person from each discipline on the team. You need to have people on the team who can do what needs to get done. Design, research, prototyping, software engineering, QA, product management, deployment, subject matter expertise, whatever it is, right? But if people can do more than one thing, that's okay. The team just needs to be able to do all of its work on its own and be empowered to actually make decisions as it builds off of that continuous feedback loop from the market. Those are the four components of the anatomy of a successful team, right? Small, co-located, dedicated, self-sufficient. The next thing I want to talk about is how do you tell a team what to do? How do you task the team? And this is certainly a viable option. You can just yell at them for a while, right? And some managers do that, right? I'm sure you've worked at a place where this is kind of that was the management style. As before, I want to start with some anti-patterns about how not to tell teams what to do. And this is probably the first one I'm going to go through is probably the most common planning pattern that I see in every company that I've interacted with lately, and it's the product roadmap. The reason why everybody uses roadmaps is because they tell a compelling story, right? It makes you look good. We're here, and we're going over here. And there are 4 steps in between, so you know how many steps we have to go. So it's easy to see status, it's easy to see progress, it's easy to see next steps, and it's easy to see when we're going to finish up. But in reality, what you're actually doing by laying out this roadmap is you're fixing time and you're fixing scope. In my experience, in the 15 years that I've been working professionally after the circus, right? Although that was professional learning there, clearly. My experience is that when you fix time and you fix scope, 3 things happen every single time. You either move the deadline, you reduce scope, or you burn out your people in the last 3 weeks with 80-hour crunch modes, right? Because the reality of roadmaps is that they often look like this. This is because there's so much unknown in software and digital product development and design. We learn things along the way. We learn that the feature that we're working on is far more complex than we actually thought it was. The interaction that we thought would solve this problem doesn't actually fix the user's need. They don't know how to use it. The competition launched the same thing we're working on, and they did it 10 times better. Right? I'll give you an example in 2008. I joined the Ladders in October of 2008. That wasn't a good year for the global economy, or a good month for the global economy. This was a job board that catered to people who made $100,000 or more. We had lots of sales and finance people, and all of a sudden, Lehman Brothers melts down, and our ecosystem looks like this. We have tons of job seekers and no jobs for them. But we had a 9-month roadmap, ready to execute. Right? What do? Do you heads down just work on it, or do you react to it? Right? And that's why roadmaps are essentially, there's only so much vision that you can have into the future, certainly not 9, 12, and 18-month visions. About a year ago or so, maybe a little less, Kent Beck, who's one of the guys who wrote the Agile Manifesto, tweeted this. And he said, product roadmaps should be lists of questions, not lists of features. And this is spot on. Right? Instead of saying we're going to build feature X, Y, Z, A, B, C, and D, we change the language and we change it into a question. We believe, right, a hypothesis. We believe that we should incorporate Facebook authentication so that people can sign in more successfully. Right? And we build these questions, and then we go forward and we try to answer those questions before we actually execute on the features. Because when you build feature-based product roadmaps, you incentivize your teams to create output, to deliver features. And when you incentivize your team to deliver features, they create bloated products. This is the Microsoft Word version of a guitar, right? 90% of this guitar is useless to 99% of the people who play guitar. Right? Thank you. If you can make sense of a guitar, right, this piece here makes sense to you. Everything else is useless except for the one person who this guitar was designed for, which is Pat Metheny. Right? He's the one person who can play this guitar because it was designed for him. But this is what products look like when you incentivize your teams to create features. And features on their own are not a measure of success. Right? There's 30 years of jokes because of this. Right? Because somebody thought this was a good idea, right? Releasing features is not a measure of success, right? Instead, what do we hope to accomplish by releasing these features? Right, that's the product roadmap. The next anti-pattern I see all the time is the annual planning process. A lot of the large companies that I work with pretty soon will start locking down budgets for 2015. How they know what's going to happen in 2015 is beyond me. How much money they'll need to dedicate to design, to research, to their mobile schema, right? Can you imagine if in 2005, I don't have my iPhone on me, it's over there, but can you imagine if in 2005 you were locking down budgets for 2006? Right? And then the iPhone comes out, right? What happens? How do you react to that? Right? You have to build some level of flexibility, of agility with a lowercase a, right, into your process. And I'll give you another example from my experience. This was not my boss, but my boss looked like that when I worked at the Ladders. And remember, the Ladders was a subscription service. And so one day the CEO who was looking at the numbers, he saw that our numbers had flatlined. Acquisition, retention, renewal, revenue, everything had flatlined, and he was getting worried. Now, he had hired all these smart people, but instead of going to them and asking them, hey, I'm seeing all these issues, how should we fix this problem? He did what he had always done, right? Deliberate strategy. He kind of retreated to his brainstorming cocoon, and then one day he came to us with his vision, and he said, what we're going to do is we're going to give all of our paying job seekers a person in New York through which all of their communications will come through, emails and phone calls, and they'll hold these job seekers' hands through the process. That's what we're going to do. And in service of that, we took 50 people and 9 months worth of effort to build the system to support this. This was our annual planning. Essentially, this took a year's worth of time to execute on, from inception until we were done. 50 people's worth of time, 9 months worth of effort to redesign the website, all the marketing, all the acquisition flows, build a call center, build in the phone systems, rewrite the code for the logic when emails come in and they have to go to specific people, hire staff, train them, write scripts, you name it, we did it for 9 months, 50 people's worth of time, and 6 months after we launched it, we shut it down. We shut it down because it didn't move a single thing. We did not have a culture of hypothesis or experimentation. As a team, we could have done things like taken a cohort of existing job seekers and given them this service. Take a researcher, use a researcher and a product manager, let them provide this service to 10 job seekers and see if it actually makes a difference in the way that they behave. Let's measure the change in their behavior. Because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to achieve specific outcomes. And the question, as you undergo these planning processes, and as you start to plan out these huge initiatives, ask your teammates, what assumptions are we making? What fundamental assumptions are we making that, if we're wrong, will cause our project or our business to fail? For example, the fundamental assumption we were making here is that 55-year-old men who made $175,000 to $250,000, which is who used our service primarily, would want to take job search advice from a 23-year-old kid. Right? That was a fundamental assumption. We could have tested that before actually building a thing, and it was completely flawed. Instead, what we want to give our teams are business outcomes to achieve. Business outcomes are a measure of customer behavior. What is the change? We design workflows. I'm going to say we design experiences. Don't get on me about that. I know it's an endless debate. We design products and services and so forth that work towards changing customer behavior. Right? Business outcomes are a measure of those changes in customer behavior. Let's give those challenges to our teams, and let's make them granular. Let's make them things that they can actually achieve. Right? Increase checkout completion rates. Reduce the number of calls to the call center. Increase the number of times people complete their online mortgage application, or the number of times people come back, the number of people who come back more than once a month to use our service. Because then you can attribute their work directly to things that they've done. And in doing so, you give teams a problem to solve and not a solution to implement. And when you do that, the teams work quickly and iteratively to determine what the best ideas are. They own their own solutions. They design better experiences, better products, and they determine what things make sense and what things are ridiculous based on these objective success criteria. Because the measure of success is the outcome, it's not the deployment of the feature itself. Now, we talked about planning, and I want to go through this, and I'll go through this relatively quickly, and we can talk about it after, during the break as well. We talked about annual planning. How do you then do, if you're not going to do annual planning, what do you do? Well, we talked about, right, there's a small team, that's trying to figure out how to move a business metric, and then they figure out a product, and then they optimize on that product. And they're using that continuous feedback loop that we talked about at the beginning, right? That continuous deployment and feedback loop with the market to figure out what to build. Now, as an organization, we build an infrastructure around them that says, we're going to incrementally fund you based on your progress towards the business outcome. And so we'll fund you for 12 weeks or a quarter. And we'll give you a quarter of the funds for next year. And it's your job as a team to come up and say, we've been working to increase retention by 25% for the last 12 weeks. We've increased retention by 12%. We've learned all these things. And if you fund us for another 3 months, this is what we plan on trying next. We don't know if it's going to work, but based on our learnings, we think this is what's going to make a difference. And then as an organization, as a leadership organization, it's your decision to make whether or not to fund them again or not. And they may get to that goal sooner than the full annual budget, and then you can move them somewhere else and have them do more work. So this is the structure we want to build around them. So we talked about the anatomy of the team and how we task the team, right? Small, dedicated, co-located, self-sufficient, right? Giving teams problems to solve and successful and business outcomes as success criteria. The last thing I want to talk about is how the team should work. What process should they use? How should we let them work? Should it be Agile, Lean, Waterfall, all of those different combinations? And once again, I'm going to start with anti-patterns about how teams should not work. First of all, a lack of cross-functional collaboration will not breed a successful innovation team. This is a slide. It's largely an excuse to use more pictures from the circus, but just to give you some context, these are the circus, the elephant people. These were 3 women who walked on large white balls up ramps. That was their act. And this is Charlie, who served our food 3 meals a day, should you choose to eat it. Now, there was no cross-functional collaboration in the circus whatsoever. In fact, there were IP wars, even down to like sub-silos. The clowns would fight with each other. That's my gag. You stole my gag from this guy, right? Seriously, there was none. I mean, just imagine just for a second if the human cannonball and the tiger trainer collaborated on an act, right? I mean, he's already flying in the air across the tent. If there was just some tigers underneath there, right? The excitement level is exponential. The effort is tiny, right? But none of that ever happened because there was no cross-functional collaboration. And it's that excitement, that exponential delight that you find in interesting apps and products and experiences that won't happen if we don't have cross-functional collaboration. The next thing we tend to do all the time is fixate on job titles. We love to put people in boxes. This is your box. You're the designer. You make the pixels pretty. This is the engineering box. Don't step out of that. You got to put the 1s and 0s in a row. Right? This is the product management box, the marketing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And we tell people what they can and can't do. And by doing so, we limit their creativity and we limit their contribution to the team, especially if they're good at 2 things. Imagine that. Someone can do 2 things, right? The story I like to share with you to illustrate this is based on this. Now, some of you, I know some of you may have seen this slide. Yeah, I got you. Thank you. Some of you may have seen this slide, so don't answer. But this is a great story. Does anybody know who this is? Anybody who hasn't seen the slide before, know who this is? Just call it out. Who? Yes! That's exactly who it is. It's Skunk Baxter. That's exactly who it is. And who's Skunk Baxter? He was a founding member of Steely Dan, and he's been in the Doobie Brothers for 700 years, however long they've been around, right? He's a legendary American rock and roll Hall of Fame guitarist. That's who he is. Anybody know what he does today? Do you know what he does today? I'm sorry. No? This is what he does today. I'll let you read it, and I'll narrate it for you. He's a civilian consultant to the U.S. government on missile defense. It's true. That's what he does. Now, if he came to the government and if he came to you and showed you his business card that said founding member of Steely Dan and the Doobie Brothers, would you ever let him anywhere near a conversation on missile defense? Right? Unlikely is the answer. Right? But the reality is the man knows a whole hell of a lot about missile defense and can provide that value. So we should allow our teammates to contribute in whatever ways they can. You never know what people are good at. Another anti-pattern is a fear of failure, right? Most organizations predicate their culture on success. If you don't succeed, you failed, you get fired. But no one ever talks about the scope of the failure. Remember, Amazon's 11.5-second experiments, right? The scope of the failure is tiny, and the learning is huge. So we have to change that culture from failure to learning. Okay, I had a VP of engineering once at a company I worked at called Web Trends, whose management strategy was to walk up and down the cubes and threaten to fire engineers. That's the culture that I'm not exaggerating. He'd walk down and he'd say, I'm going to fire you. What are you doing? Finish that up. I'm going to fire you. And so all of the engineers in that organization did everything they could not to get fired, which was the bare minimum. No one ever pushed the envelope. No one ever questioned anything. And certainly no one ever collaborated. Consider the scope of failure and change that to learning. Another thing is deadlines. Deadlines are often arbitrary. They're made up as a motivational tool. If you don't need to have a deadline, don't put one on your team. Just give them these opportunities to kind of re-up their funding as a team. If you do need to have a deadline for a trade show or a conference or something, then the scope has to be flexible, or you're setting your teams up for failure with that fixed time and fixed scope initiative. All of these things create a culture where no one owns the product. If everyone's afraid to fail and they're just crunch moding towards the deadline, no one owns anything. They're just trying to get the bare minimum amount of work out, and they're not collaborating. And it creates this culture of CYA, right? This cover your ass culture, where everybody's just like, well, I'm just gonna do my part so I don't get fired, and I'll just hand it off to that next person. And so then how does a culture of innovation change the way a team works? Right? How should the team work if all of these things are not the way it should work? There's a couple of things. First and foremost, we're going to take smaller risks. Two principles that come from Lean are that you're always moving from doubt to certainty, right? Remember at the beginning we talked about we have no idea what the end state of the software is going to be, or if there even is an end state. And we learn as we move forward. And so we're always moving from doubt to certainty, and we do so by working in small batches. We take small risks, we run these experiments, we make the cupcake before we make the cake. That's first. The next thing, we've talked about this a lot, is we give our teams clear definitions of success. Success is when you increase the number of times people visit the site on a monthly basis to 2.5 or 3 or whatever it is. That's the definition of success, not the deployment of features. We want to make sure that we promote competencies over roles. If people can do multiple things, let them do it. Inevitably, when you move into more of a delivery phase, people will fall back to their core competencies, but don't limit their contributions to the teams. And most importantly, let your team self-organize. This lengthy quote up here is from Jeff Nicholson, who invented the Post-it note. And he said when they were still thinking about it and trying to figure it out, 3M tried to impose Six Sigma process on top of it. Six Sigma optimizes production. And he said, we didn't even know if this was a good idea. We had no idea if it was a good idea or a bad idea, if people would use it. You can't optimize something for production that we have no idea if it actually has any value. Let your teams figure out how to work, build these structures, and then let them figure out how to work well together. You can get them started, right? Give them time, you can give them a framework to start from, right? 2-week cycles, plan at the beginning, do a retrospective at the end, and check in every day for a few minutes. But beyond that, let them figure out what tools and processes and communication channels make the best sense for them. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before I wrap up is this. This is really hard work. We heard a lot about culture in the morning in Kim's session as well. Why should you do this? Right, this is hard. You're changing process, you're changing culture. Process is a reflection of your culture. This is hard work. And there's at least 3 reasons that I could think of to do this. The first is that you'll make your customers happy because you'll build great products, design great experiences that they actually want to use, that solve their business problems, and that make you more profitable as an organization. The second is that you're going to reduce waste inside your organization by not working on things that aren't going to be successful, or not spending time on things that aren't going to meet the customer's goal and the business goal. And then finally, employee morale goes through the roof. People feel like they're a part of something. They want to work there. They own their solutions. They take pride in their work. They tell their friends. Smart people come work with you, and it becomes a much better place to work. All of this, everything that I've just told you in the last 40 minutes or so, is in service of this. As you're thinking about supporting a culture of innovation and building these teams, you have to change the mentality of your team, of your organization, and of your company from one of delivery, right, pushing features out the door, to one of learning. Thank you very much.